and our last speaker, Klaus Abels, and his talk, Don't Repair the Island. It ain't broke.
Being the last speaker, it falls on me to say some pleasantries, like thanks to the organizers, to Ana Maria, Aritz, Miriam, and Vidal. I think we should really thank them. I think this has been a very, very fun conference. And so this talk presents work in progress. And so what I'm trying to say is to make the point as strong as possible so that you can show me where the gaping holes are. And then maybe I'll moderate the tone later on if that turns out to be required. And John Balin once said to me, well, I want to hear what you have to say because I want to get some quality shit. And I like that about my paper, and I like that expression, so I really invite you to give me that. Now the thesis, the statement, what I'm trying to pursue is that for strong islands, the idea that there's actually repair, or the examples that seem to show that there's island repair, that those are sort of illusory. It doesn't actually exist. That's the idea. And if that turns out to be true, Howard mentioned that this has been an idea that's been around since the Baker and Brain paper. If that turns out to be true, then a lot of this discussion of the representational status of islands we can do away with that. We can construe of islands as derivational constraints. Okay, so and since so much rides on this, we would be well advised to have very, very strong evidence for the positions that we take. And since we're dealing with elliptical phenomena, probing the structures that we see is not entirely straightforward. And there's often multiple possible analyses, as again Howard pointed out in his talk, that for many cases of ellipsis, you don't know whether you're dealing with something very big that remains unpronounced or something very small, whether in a sluice you say what blah 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 blah, or whether you're saying what it is. And the strongest arguments, the most direct arguments for unpronounced, to diagnose the unpronounced structure comes from various kinds of connectivity, where I understand connectivity in the broadest sense of the word. So for example, case matching is for me connectivity, piping of prepositions is for me connectivity, and island effects is a kind of connectivity. And so if we turn to various constructions that involve ellipsis, we see that we have these connectivity effects. So in stripping, we have connectivity effects. I'm essentially just going to skip because the whole day has already been about these sorts of structures. Look at all the previous talks for relevant data. Stripping shows case connectivity, stranding, non-stranding of prepositions type of connectivity, and it shows island connectivity. So you have cases of stripping that look like long-distance movement, like in 5. Lucy will admit that she stole the diamonds if you press her, but not the car. I redo this in German, where there's overt case marking, and we can do long-distance movement, but then stripping dies in island contexts. So, or at least certain readings die. So if you take on page 3, example number 7, just as an illustration, I met a boy who ate an apple and also an orange. That sentence is ungrammatical on the reading where you're trying to say, I met a boy who ate an apple, and I also met a boy who ate an orange, but it is grammatical on the reading where there's only one boy. So it has a short construal. I met a boy who ate an apple, and also an orange is short for and also an orange he ate. And again, 7b is just a control from German with case morphology in it, just so that we can be a little more sure that there's actual structure down there. And I think everybody who wants to think about this should actually read Fukaya's 2007 thesis on these things. I think it's probably the most careful and best discussion of this sort of stuff, where the discussion is extremely careful in terms of what readings are available, and this is very carefully controlled, and I think it's a must read. Okay, so what stripping shows you, and some of the other constructions that were discussed this morning already, is that certain ellipsis phenomena give you connectivity effects with case, with p-stranding, and with islands. VP ellipsis is a candidate for that. It's a bit rare cross-linguistically. I don't have full data sets for any good language where I can show all the properties. But so one question with VP ellipsis, it's clear that VP ellipsis has no island amelioration effects, but Howard has, of course, argued, and he repeated that argument in his talk, that VP ellipsis is so constrained in terms of movement out of the ellipsis site that there's just no long movement altogether, which renders island constraints, island violations, moot as a diagnostic. But that judgment isn't universally shared. So there are examples in the literature, for example, in Fiango in May 94, that purport to show long distance construals for VP ellipsis. Reinhardt has some examples. The examples in 9b that I give to illustrate that VP ellipsis allows long construals is sort of modeled on Fiango and May's example, and my informants say it's, I mean, there's still a question mark there, but it's not terrible. So I know which book Max thinks Mary wants and which book Bill does. On the interpretation, Bill thinks Mary wants. And yeah. So if VP ellipsis allows these kinds of things, then VP ellipsis is another kind of case where you have ellipsis not rescuing island violations. And then the examples in 10 and 11, the familiar island violations that survive under ellipsis, under VP ellipsis, are relevant. Section 3 gives you contrast sluicing, but again, because of Anniko's and James's talk this morning, I don't think I need to walk you through those data. So these examples are contrast sluices of the type Hans helped a woman, but I don't know who else he helped. Hans helped a woman, but I don't know who else. And I give you German examples here that show case marking so that we can exclude a number of other potential sources for these sluices. And as reported earlier by Anniko and James, we get island effects here in contrast sluicing. So there's a class of ellipsis phenomena that seem to show regular behavior with respect to island effects. And then you come to sluicing, and things change. Sluicing also shows connectivity effects. It also shows case connectivity effects. As Howard reminded us, and I give example 18 to show you this, which is from Ross's paper. Will jemandem schmeicheln, aber Sie wissen nicht wem. he wants to flatter somebody, but they don't know who. The who has to be in the dative case and can't be in the accusative case, and that's because flatter requires dative. Then there's the preposition stranding connectivity, languages that allow preposition stranding, allow sluices with preposition stranding, and by and large, languages that don't allow preposition stranding don't allow sluicing with preposition stranding. But this is actually sort of interesting because over the last 10 years, a number of counterexamples, superficial counterexamples have been raised to this. Italian came up in the discussion yesterday. Serbo-Croatian is out there in the literature, Polish, Brazilian Portuguese, Spanish, Indonesian, Amis. There's even some English cases where there's no perfect patterning. And I'll come back to that issue and to that discussion in a moment. But there's so if we set aside those counterexamples for a moment, there are plenty of languages that where you see connectivity for preposition stranding under sluicing. So we have case connectivity, you have connectivity for preposition stranding, and then from the perspective of the three other constructions that I mentioned earlier, somewhat very surprisingly, sluicing all of a sudden doesn't show island effects. Doesn't show island effects. There's no island connectivity. And those are the also, I don't want to bore you with these examples. So these are the merchant examples, the merchant facts. And if you're if you want to look at this further, you know, I provide German cases with non-nominative case for all of these, and they're good. So it looks like all of a sudden sluicing is the odd one out because it allows islands to be ameliorated. So before tackling that, I'd like to come back to the p-stranding facts. The main strategy in the literature for solving the problem of a language that doesn't allow p-stranding, usually, but does allow it under sluicing, is to say that there is another source for the sluice, and usually that's some kind of copulative construction. So, for example, Szczegielniak does this for Polish. The same type of argument's been given for Brazilian Portuguese and Spanish, where the analysis suggests there's a pseudo-sluicing or some similar kind of source for apparent preposition stranding under sluicing. And that suggests that you really have to take very seriously something that Howard mentioned many times in his talk, which was that Merchant's arguments for saying that there is a full clausal structure in the sluice can be diagnosed in using certain diagnostics, but there's no diagnostic that shows you that there's always a full clausal source. It's just not there. And that opens the possibility that in some cases you have a full clausal source, and in some cases you have a pseudo-sluice as a source. And van Kranenbroek, 2010, goes through these diagnostic properties one by one and shows what a theory would tell you that said, well, usually you get a full clausal source for the p-stranding cases, but then when you can't do that, you're allowed to move over and give a short source. So short sources as a last resort. And that's sort of the strategy, the mostly implicit strategy that people use in that whole literature on p-stranding. And so you actually need to make sure on a case-by-case basis, you can't just say, oh, here's sluicing, so there's a full clausal source. You have to actually make sure on a case-by-case basis, this is what we learned from that the actual example that you're looking at can't have a different source, that it must have the full clausal source, and it can't have a pseudo-sluice as a source, and it can't have anything else as a source. And so the first way to rule that out that I've used in this handout is to give examples in German with non-nominative case throughout. And that rules out the pseudo-sluicing sources, period. But it means that the vast majority of English examples on sluicing with island amelioration are very suspect. So Merchant says because most of them actually have a potential source as a pseudo-sluice. So if you remind yourself what were Merchant's arguments for saying that sluicing is not pseudo-sluicing, he gave 10. So he said adjunct and implicit arguments don't appear in clefts as pivots of clefts, but they do appear in sluices. Well, those don't repair islands. He had a prosodic argument which is sort of irrelevant, I think, and I don't actually quite understand it. He gave an aggressive non-delinking argument, what the hell, which is just, I think, entirely irrelevant because it doesn't even distinguish between clefts and non-clefts as the source. Then he mentions some modification as an argument. So if you have a sentence like, you should speak to somebody in the legal department, Joe said we should speak to somebody in the legal department, but he didn't say who, for example. Those cases can't appear as pivots of clefts. As far as I know, nobody has looked at whether that ameliorates islands. I would be surprised if it did. There is all modification, so modification of a WH word by all, which is not very good under sluicing, but is good as pivots of clefts and is good in regular WH questions, and it's just entirely irrelevant. Then he gives else modification as an argument, because else modification, so who else, can't appear as the pivot of a cleft, but we saw, I remember the talk earlier this morning, those don't repair islands. There's no pseudo-sluicing source there, and those don't repair islands. Merchant gives swiping as an argument, the possibility to invert the preposition in the WH word under sluicing. But Howard has claimed I've heard you say this, and I couldn't, since my computer broke, figure out where that's actually written down, that swiping is largely restricted to sprouting contexts, and sprouting doesn't repair islands. So we don't have that as a diagnostic. Languages with a limited cleft strategy vis-a-vis English are not relevant because we're looking at English. Case matching is not relevant because English doesn't have a relevant case morphology. And the final argument against the pseudo-sluice as the general source for clefts comes from left branch extraction. And again, here, if we look, left branch extraction doesn't seem to repair islands. Grebeňová has argued for that contention. So if we actually try to use the diagnostics that are supposed to show that something is not a pseudo-sluice in English, these diagnostics at least, then we find nothing. Now they could all be pseudo-sluices. So we look at a language where it's a bit easier, namely a case marking language. And I'm in section 5 now. And I'm going to illustrate some island effects that happen under sluicing. So example 29. Well, that's not an island effect. That's just a regular sluice. So every player, I don't even know what's there. So look at example 30. The example says, jeder Spieler schreibt alle Konsonanten auf, die in einem bestimmten Wort enthalten sind, aber er verrät den anderen nicht welches. Er verrät den anderen nicht in welchem. Every player writes all consonants up that in a particular word contained are, but discloses the others not in which. Every player writes down all the consonants that some word contains, but doesn't tell the others which word. And what I did here is I used, in German, in which word, so I get p-stranding connectivity, so I know that I'm not dealing with a pseudo-sluice. And this is not good. So if the interpretation is supposed to be, he doesn't tell the others for which word it is the case that he wrote down all the consonants that that word contains, that interpretation is not available. You get complex NP violations, 31 in sluicing. So here I need to give you a little bit of background in case you don't follow German politics. This spring, a number of German politicians resigned over, or were forced to give back their PhD titles because they had cheated. And there were actually quite a few of them. And for one particular politician, there was a huge scandal around this. And then for the others, it was sort of a much more quiet affair. And so suppose that I remember which politicians had to give back their theses, their doctorates, but I don't remember the identity of the one where the big scandal erupted. Suppose that's the context. Now, if there was real island amelioration with sluicing, I ought to be able to say now, 31. Die Tatsache, dass einem Politiker oder einem bestimmten Politiker, a particular politician, die Tatsache, dass einem Politiker sein Doktortitel entzogen worden ist, hat die Gemüter stark erregt, aber ich weiß nicht mehr welchem. Dative. So that ought to be possible. It ought to be able to mean the fact that a certain politician had his doctorate revoked has stirred up a big scandal, but I can't remember which politician. Meaning, which politician is such that the fact that he had his doctorate revoked caused a big scandal. But it just can't mean that. The only thing that it could mean is which politician had his doctorate revoked. Huh? That looks like a complex MP constraint under sluicing. Yeah, 32 is simply the same example without the fact that, and it's equally bad. And then 33 is an example with an adjunct condition violation. It requires an extremely complicated context, unfortunately. I haven't been able to come up with some that are less convoluted. So the sentence is, in 33, is fast niemand ist abgehauen, weil mit einem der Gäste oder einem bestimmten Gast gestritten hat, aber Silke wollte nicht verraten, mit welchem Gast. Almost nobody left because he quarreled with a particular guest, but Silke didn't want to disclose which guest. Now, if there was extraction out of the island in the sluice, this ought to be compatible with the following complicated situation. Many people have quarreled with many guests. Many people left as a result of these quarrels. But there's one guest who quarreled with many others, but those quarrels caused almost nobody to leave. But Silke is unwilling to disclose who that special guest is that can quarrel with people without sending them home. And I can't get that reading. Apparently the same facts obtain in Spanish. If you want to look at them, translations of these examples into Spanish here. I've looked at a few other languages and still need to look more. But the cross-linguistic pattern for translations of these examples are encouraging. And they're all constructed in such a way that the indefinites in the antecedent of the sluice take widest scope. So that the main problem that Howard raised in his 2001 paper for Merchant's version of this argument is controlled for. Okay, so what can we say as an analysis of this? So the literature on p-stranding under sluicing, as I said, suggests that pseudo-sluicing is sometimes an option, sort of as a last resort for the analysis of sluicing. So we can't just throw that away offhand. And we also know that sometimes the source of a sluice must be a short source. We've already seen some examples of that. Here's another one, 40A. This is actually from the Baker and Brain paper. I confirmed the rumor that Mary married someone important, but I haven't been able to find out who. This has a reading that can be paraphrased as 40C. I confirmed the rumor that Mary married someone important, but I haven't been able to find out who she married. Where the antecedent of that sluice, who she married, is the relative clause. Sorry, it's not a relative clause. This is not a relative clause, guys. This is a complement to the noun rumor. So that Mary married is the antecedent for the question. That Mary married someone important is the antecedent for who she married. I'll skip 41. So in 42, I claim this is about 41, so I skip it. 43. We also know that there can be mismatches between the antecedent of the sluice and the thing that you sluice. So if the antecedent of the sluice is something like the imperative amuse me, you can follow that with what? Or how. But what you have in the sluice is probably, if you want to really resolve it, is something like, with what should I amuse you? Rather than the imperative. So the imperative mood has gone away, you've thrown in an additional modal, but that still counts as identical for sluicing, apparently, for ellipsis. So there are substantial mismatches in this area that we need to allow. Similarly, this example is from Ross's original paper on sluicing. Bill seems to be doing away with someone, but he won't say who. The interpretation here is who he's doing away with, rather than who he seems to be doing away with. But that's an infinitival in the antecedent, and it's a finite clause in the when you resolve it. And it's 46, also from Ross's papers, is even worse. So together, these considerations tell us that we must allow short construals for sluices, and that we need to and that we need to make space, enough wiggle room for non-identity, for not imperfect identity. And for the else cases, we need these short construals with quite a few structural changes anyway. So she met a boy who was eating an apple, but I don't know what else. That can only mean what else he was eating, not I don't know what other thing is such that she made a boy, a potentially different boy, who was eating that other thing. But if you want to spell out what's there in the sluice, you get what else he was eating, and that means you've changed the trace of the relative operator in the antecedent into a pronoun in the actual sluice. So you have to be allowed to do that sort of non-identity matching as well. Now, if you have these short construals and you allow changes in the I domain of the type that I've mentioned, in particular if you allow modals to appear there, that's a very, very powerful device, as Merchant already knew. So, for example, you can easily deal with sentences like 50. Die Firmenleitung hat das Gerücht bestritten, dass sie mit der IG Metall verhandeln wird, aber ich weiß nicht mit welcher anderen Gewerkschaft. So, management has denied the rumor that it will negotiate with the metallurgical union, but I don't know with which other union. There's a short source for this, which says with which other union management, and in English there's no modal for this, but German has a modal for purportedly do something, sollen. So I can stick in a modal there, and actually it's a trivial modal semantics that you need to stick in there, and then you get with which other union management, according to this rumor, is supposed to be negotiating, which is the apparent island violating construal of this example. So what happens in the examples that I gave you earlier, the ones where I said that sluicing actually shows island behavior, is that there is just no such short source available. So for the example with the rules of the game, every player writes down all consonants that some word contains, but doesn't tell the others which word. If you try to make up a short source for that, then you get which word contains them. That's wrong, because there are many words that are going to contain those consonants. Which word supposedly contains them? That's wrong. That doesn't give you the right semantics. An existential modal doesn't work either. Which word may contain them? So there's no short source for this particular sluice, and you get an island effect coming out. The same for the example with the German politicians who cheated on their PhDs. So remember, the fact that a certain politician had his doctorate revoked caused a big stir, but I don't remember which politician. In German, because of the dative marking, there's no source like which politician it is. But there's also no other short source. So which politician had his doctorate removed is the wrong reading, and I can't think of any modal, whether it's existential or universal, that would give you the right reading there. So it looks like if you really make sure that short construals are impossible, the island violations come up again in sluices, and these are non-contrast sluices. So this is, if these data are right, then that's a problem for the generalization of Anniko and James's earlier. So the conclusion from this is that the general case, sluicing might not be the general case. All these other constructions might be the general case, and there's a particular source for the illusory island amelioration under sluicing, and that source are these short construals. And then I still owe you some kind of answer to the question that I anticipate from at least from Howard. So why is it that other kinds of connectivity effects seem to diagnose that all this structure is there inside of the sluice? And I think the best I can do for that is to say that this is actually an illusion. So there are other cases where the acceptability judgments that people give deviate from what we basically need to think the grammaticality judgments are. So people accept stuff that's actually ungrammatical, quite robustly accepted. Even trained linguists accept it. Although, for all we know, it must be bad. And the reason is that you get tricked by ambiguity, by an ambiguity of the surface form, into accepting something that doesn't actually have an analysis. So this has been discussed in a paper by Fanselo and Frisch in 2006, where they studied things like agreement with disjunction in German. So I or he. So the example is supposed to mean it is or it could be my or his turn, and in German, so you disjoin the subject, and now you need to figure out what agreement to do, and you just can't. Ich oder er bin an der Reihe. I or him am at my turn is bad. I or him is at the turn is bad. I or him are at the turn is bad. There's no good resolution to this problem. But if you use a modal here, the modals don't show a formal distinction between the first and the third person. And all of a sudden, when you say ich oder er könnte an der Reihe sein, people all of a sudden accept that. And this is a potential case where there's an illusion, where you're required to have two separate analyses for könnte that are incompatible with each other, but you accept it anyway because they sort of collapse. And Fanselo and Frisch discuss another sort of case where something that ought to be worse improves because of a surface ambiguity, a temporary surface ambiguity. So this is a stable, a final surface ambiguity. They conducted this experiment in the Potsdam region, and that's a region of Germany where people are not so fond of long cyclic extraction across complementizers. And so they looked at examples like 59a and 59b. Wem glaubst du, dass geholfen hat? Who dative do you believe that he helped? Who do you believe that he helped? Versus who do you believe he has seen? Help takes dative, see takes accusative. And the examples with see were judged by their informants as worse than the examples with help. And the reason for that, the pattern, is that the verb believe, glauben, can take a dative object. And so their analysis says, well, when you read something like 59a and you speak a dialect that doesn't like long extraction, you try to interpret, as you go, you try to interpret who as the argument of glauben. And that's a fine, short construal. And then you read on, you read the rest of the clause, you find out that it actually had to be the object of help. But at that point, basically, you've already decided that it's a fine sentence, and so you say, yeah, that's good. The same is not true in 59b, where you've extracted an accusative, because believe doesn't take an accusative object. And so people judge this as being worse, which is the regular pattern for this dialect. So temporary ambiguities can lead, this is kind of a garden path making the judgments better rather than worse in some sense. And I think I would try to push the line that the types of examples that Howard has been producing are sort of illusory goodness of the type in 59a and of the type that you see in 57.
Questions?
Couple of small observations and then maybe a somewhat bigger question. The observation has to do with stuff in the middle of page 4 about long extraction out of VP ellipsis.
Yeah.
As you've urged us throughout, we always want to do controlled experiments. And I think the results are slightly different than you indicated when we do a controlled experiment. So let's look at your example 10. Abby wants to hire someone who speaks a certain Balkan language, but I don't remember what kind of language she does, or she doesn't. Yeah, she doesn't is what we want there. Let's try to make an example as parallel to that as we can, but without an island. So maybe Abby wants to say that she speaks Greek, but I don't remember what language she doesn't. And that doesn't seem so good to me, even though there's no island. So there is something about long extraction and VP ellipsis, even if it's maybe not as trivial as might have originally been presented.
Yeah, so the example that you give is also not terribly plausible. I've tried to come up with, yeah, no, it's obviously it's a good point. And I've tried to come up with some that are entirely parallel to the to 10, and those are judged worse than my 9b consistently. That's you're absolutely right.
Okay, next smallish observation. Pseudo-sluicing, in a lot of respects, does seem like a very plausible source. And as you say, I actually, in my seminar a couple of years ago, I went through Merchant's arguments and ticked off most of them, as you did today, as irrelevant to the real issue. However, pseudo-sluicing analysis does presuppose something that I don't think has ever really been articulated in the discussions of it, namely that you can take something like, who is it, and turn it into who. And it's perfectly conceivable if that's true. I have a minor argument that you can't. If I hear a knocking at the door, most natural thing to say in English is, who is it? But it's very unnatural to say who. So that's a minor argument that the rule needed for a pseudo-sluicing source doesn't actually exist in English. And then the bigger point you sort of hinted at in the last sentence of your talk, and I'll just bring it out in the open. Another kind of connectivity can be relevant, and I admit it's not so easy to construct really clear examples of it, but in my writings I've tried to give some. In my talk I gave one or two. That's reconstruction. And actually yesterday, sitting here, I scrawled down another one that seemed to me at least relatively convincing. The ad said the lecture will be about every syntactician and a certain type of criticism of him. But the ad didn't say exactly what type of criticism of him, where it's coordinate structure constraint violation, where it seems like you might need reconstruction in order for the pronoun to be in the scope of the universal quantifier.
I'll need that example in writing before I can even.
No, I'm just trying to illustrate a general point.
Yeah, I mean the who is it case, that's interesting, because I think that there are some other examples that sort of seem to go the other way. You know, those other kinds of fragments that Jason discussed. You know, the guys bring the fridge and put it in your kitchen and say, like new. And where you seem to have elided, it is like new. And there are good reasons to think that in that particular kind of construction, you are actually eliding, cross-linguistic reasons to think that here you are eliding a copulative structure. So, for example, German in the copulative construction has adjectives without any agreement, and that's exactly what you have to use in the like new type of example. And in Norwegian or Spanish, where it goes the other way, where predicates under the copula agree with the subject, these adjectives have to agree. So it seems to pattern with what you find in copulative constructions. So there's an argument there that English does have some kind of rule of that source. Now that's not exactly pseudo-sluicing, right? And it's not exactly the, so at the beginning I said pseudo-sluicing or some other kind of copulative source, and part of the reason for that was exactly this. It might not be a version with an expletive but with actually some kind of referential pronoun and copula, and that's what you delete.
Let me bring up one more data point. I jotted this down and forgot, but your discussion of these modal sources, I think is very interesting, and we discussed it over dinner for about an hour last night. Extremely interesting idea. I do have a data point about the specific English example you give. That's in 44, on page 13. Amuse me with what or what with. Those are fine, as you say, and they seem to be pretty much equivalent pragmatically to what should I amuse you with. On the other hand, interesting, I mean, we do have to, I'm about to give another possible source. Controlling for the fact that indexicals under circumstances that have been discussed over the last few decades can vary. I think there's another possible source. So you say amuse me, and I can say to you, amuse you with what? And that seems to capture exactly the right meaning with, as far as I can tell, no needed modal. So.
Thanks. Yeah, that hadn't occurred to me.
I'll ask a question that was prompted by Miriam's comment on the very last part about the case connectivity effects. I'd like them not to be real. I mean, for independent reasons. So I think what you said is promising, but I have a question about the Kunter example that you gave. So the first argument from Fanselo, I believe. Are these production or just judgment
no,
data?
This is a judgment study.
But so what about the cases of sluicing? So does this happen just in terms of judgment, these phantom goodness effects, or do we actually have evidence that people do produce these bad things that actually judge good?
I would have to. I mean, it's relatively. It's because the set of verbs that show this particular morphological ambiguity in German is pretty small.
Mm.
You can probably do a corpus search, or in fact, Google it.
Yeah.
And I can't remember whether Fanselo and Frisch did that.
I thought they didn't, if I remember correctly. And that may be relevant because in the sluicing cases, if you ask people to just produce those cases, it's not that they're judging them, they are actually producing them with the connectivity effects. And that might actually be different from just saying, yeah, it sounds good to me. So maybe it's not as strong as...
But so you're saying you have actual examples of people producing sluices with islands with connectivity effects?
Well, you can certainly ask people to just, so you construct the example, right? And you ask them to produce it. And then in that case, do they actually produce the form that has no, nice grammatical source or not? So it seems to be the case that it's possible for, maybe linguists to produce those examples. And that might be different from the cases you discussed at the end. Maybe. Maybe,
yeah. I mean, yeah. So one would have to try to construct a production task for these and see what people do.
So I was wondering if these sort of pseudo-sluicing or other ways of amelioration are possible. Why are they not possible in the contrastive sluicing? So for the other cases,
thanks.
Why couldn't you?
Thanks. Yeah, because there is no source. So if you try it, so thank you. Completely very this is a very important point, of course. So if you look at a contrast case, which one?
Maybe 15.
15. Yeah, well, I mean that's 15 is very similar to the one where the island effect also shows up in actual sluicing because there is no source. So that might not be the best case. But let's look at 16. I met a boy who was eating an apple, but I won't tell you what else. So if you just have what, you can continue with I met a boy who ate something, but I don't know what he ate. And that's equivalent for all intents and purposes as, but I don't know what, for which thing I met a boy who ate that thing. But in the what else case, I met a boy who was eating an apple, but I don't know what else. The short construal gives you, but I don't know what else he was eating, which is the available reading. And there's no way you can make a short one that says what else that would introduce a new discourse reference for a person that you met.
But for the cases that Aniko and James discussed before, with the contrastive cases, wouldn't I don't recall now the example.
Well, the contrastive cases are
it's hard because I don't have a concrete example now in my head, but it just seems that those were really similar enough that you should be able to.
Yeah, so that's a prediction. I didn't see any during the talk, but it's definitely important to go through it and see because if so in general, and this is actually Fukaya's point in this 2007 thesis, in general, the contrast sluices allow you to distinguish the short and the long reading. That's sort of not the mathematically provable theorem, but it's sort of fact. Whereas sluices, because they ask about the identity of something that you establish with an indefinite, and that's the structure of the sluice. Mary wants to hire somebody who speaks a particular Balkan language. Now we have an indefinite that's supposed to take widest scope for scope parallelism to obtain. So now we have an indefinite that we've introduced. Wrong. That was the wrong thing to say. We have only one individual there, and then the other discourse references that are hanging about you can refer to them with pronouns. So what language he should speak. But now if you're trying to do something, she wants to hire somebody who speaks Greek, but I don't know what other language. The only reading is what other language he should speak. That's the short construal. The long construal, again, there's just no source. So if there are cases of contrast where a short construal gives you a reading that's equivalent to the long construal, then the prediction is you should get illusory long readings.
Yeah, a related question. I was, what about the sprouting cases, like John wants to hire someone that knows how to cook, but I don't know what, which is out. Why you cannot continue like, but I don't know what he or she should cook. right?
Yeah, that it doesn't matter. So I think the fact about these is correctly characterized by the extremely narrow scope of the implicit object, and so the short version of this that you just gave presupposes that there is something that person should be able to cook. So that gives you sort of a wide scope reading for the object. But that is not licensed by the antecedent.
Right? If the issue is the scope of the indefinite in the antecedent, then how to derive the basic fact of John is eating, but I don't know what, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that that John is eating entails that there is something that John is eating. And so therefore then you can ask, what is John eating? But in the example that you gave, that sort of entailment just doesn't go through. So who knows how to cook? Blah 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 blah. Who knows how to cook? That doesn't entail there is something such that Mary wants to hire somebody who knows how to cook that, and it also doesn't entail even the slightly lower scope where Mary has something specific in mind that he has to know how to cook, which is an entailment of the short construal that you gave. I think that's the source of why you can't do that.
Yeah, I want to support that point. Merchant, in his book, claimed to be able to derive the island boundedness of sprouting by talking about the island boundedness of the scope of these implicit arguments. And in fact, I think he might even have cited this paper from 30 years ago by Fodor and Fodor. But what Fodor and Fodor actually showed was not that these things are island bounded, but that they're even clause bounded. Now, what Klaus is suggesting, I think it's right, they're even more bounded than that. Like if there's a modal, they can't even get beyond the modal. I think they take narrow scope with respect to anything else around. And sort of a generalization of what Fodor and Fodor said.
All right. No more questions?